Alright, welcome back to another VR benchmark video. You read the title, you know why you're here. We're looking at the 4090 versus the 5090 on the Pimax Crystal. Because unlike the Quest 3, this actually is a physically high-res display headset, and it's not just simulated. The 5090 showed some shockingly impressive numbers for VR performance in my last video, especially notable considering the rather lackluster results if you look at most flat screen comparisons. Though it could also be really game dependent. So some more data is always good, especially because there were some people who thought the fact I was playing wireless somehow made it that much better because of the 5090's encoders. And those people were wrong. However, before we jump into the numbers, there is a very big disclaimer I have to talk about concerning the data and VR benchmarking in general, especially for anyone who wants to try and replicate my results for transparency's sake. Investigating this was one reason why this video took so long, the other being that till recently the 5000 series had micro stutter in VR. At least on wired headsets, it didn't appear to affect the Quest 3, at least from what I could tell, and I was also too sick to do anything for almost 2 weeks. This said, some of the results were still strange on the 5090 in a way that I can't just talk about in the relevant section, so let's have a disclaimer here and give some context. The RTX 5000 series has supposedly had the micro stutter issue fixed, and I think that's probably true, at least for the one they were addressing then. But there seems to now be a different issue causing micro stutter in VR. And this appears to be what happens when in some games when you're hitting hertz limitations and getting VSync on your headset. This Reddit thread by Stamper, link will be in the description, who also did some investigation and found the issue was replicable in both flat screen and VR. And I have also noticed this even on the current drivers with some games where I was slamming into the FPS cap. I was getting some micro stutter which affected the 0.1% low quite a bit. Cases like where I have over 100 FPS with the 1% low, but the 0.1% low are consistently in the low 60s, like in the Kayak VR example on screen right now. That's a pretty absurd gap. But here's another issue and why I'm using CapFrameX instead of, say, FPS VR, because that doesn't appear to capture the micro stutter, which Stamper also reported. Here's a sped up run with Kayak VR with FPS VR, mind the recording penalty, that's effectively dropless 120 FPS if you go by the frame times, because anything that's 8.3 milliseconds or lower means we're hertz limited at delivering my HMD's max 120 hertz. And the GPU is not stressed either. We get single digit spike, but they're practically not there, and even when they appear, they're not bad and would not explain the drops into the 60s that CapFrameX reports. So if we look at FPS VR's results, the 0.1% low frame time of 8.4 milliseconds corresponded to 119 FPS, which is, shouldn't have to say this, but that's kind of a lot higher than CapFrameX's sub 63 FPS. So in this case, I think FPS VR isn't accurately measuring the performance. I'm a little skeptical of it right now because something clearly seems to be going on that's not capturing, because if you check the Reddit thread, there are a lot of people still reporting the issues, and even I noticed a few things that felt kind of weird in the headset. FPS VR can be better for hertz limited scenarios, as CapFrameX cannot measure beyond any HMD's hertz rate and even has the frame time plot for it, which is still limited to whatever your hertz rate is, more or less, if things are working right at least. It caps out around there. But FPS VR measures frame times on the CPU and GPU independently rather than just overall. So it can give you a good idea of performance and headroom when already maxing out your HMD. But here's the problem though. Frame times alone, just like FPS, may not tell the whole story, and I don't know if there might be issues in general with how FPS VR is measuring, or if it might just be more quirky little fun things with Blackwell. Here's an example I took in Riven, one where my 7950X3D was not affinity masked to run on the Vcache, the other was with and toggled it off about 10 seconds apart. Don't look at average FPS, only the current and the frame times, had to use my phone screenshot since recording affected GPU usage. If we go by the frame times, I should be fully GPU bound because my CPU frame times are way below it. But going by GPU frame times, I should be at 92 FPS because 10.8 milliseconds is 92.59 FPS. Almost 10% better. But with the affinity mask, my FPS goes up to 88 and usage is now 94%. Performance has improved slightly just from a change on CPU, despite frame times not indicating a CPU bottleneck. However, my actual FPS being delivered is still falling short of what the 10.7 millisecond frame time would indicate, which is 93.46 FPS. Is it a lot? No. Is it enough to be statistically significant of a near 6% difference? Yes, it is. And when checking the 1% or 0.1% low between FPS VR and Cat Frame X, even when not Hertz limited, I saw some massive differences between the two if you converted FPS VR's frame times to FPS. But the average FPS, as that's the only FPS metric VR has from what I see, that was typically near identical on both and matched up. I'm gonna save further explanation on why VR benchmarking is hell for a dedicated video though, once I have more time to look at things thoroughly. I don't want this to be the whole video, but I want it to be stated in case anyone else has the 5090 and feels like doing some benchmarks, because there are just a lot of quirky little things with this card right now. So clearly there is still something wrong with the 5000 series under certain conditions, especially for VR. Lots of people were reporting that stutter in that Reddit thread besides me, but it's not in every game. And it does affect multiple headsets, as Earth Stamper measured with an index while I have a Pimax. Both are wired DP headsets though versus the Quest 3, which is using wireless, and I didn't really see the issue with that, so it could be a wired thing. Whatever the case, Cat Frame X does appear to catch these micro stutters, while FPS VR does not. It has generally more GPU metrics, so I'll be sticking with Cat Frame X going forward for GPU comparison. Most of my measurements here weren't that Hertz limited anyway. In the future, after doing more research, I may reevaluate or change how I do things a bit. Might use FPS VR for more significantly Hertz limited situations if trying to compare multiple programs doesn't make me want to retire myself from the census, and if it seems reliable. It is specialized for VR rendering, while I don't think Cat Frame X is, but definitely some strange behavior which is making question the reliability, at least right now with whatever Blackwell has going on, especially when average FPS lined up with Cat Frame X but not the frame times. Point is, there's a chance the 5090 could still be underperforming in wired VR based on what it should be if the micro stutter is still present. If you want to test it yourself, I might use a different program from FPS VR till whatever's wrong with the 5000 series is fixed. Anyway, secondly, one more quick note on the game selection. I mentioned I was going to try including some more games, and I did take requests, but once again, because of how sick I was for nearly 2 weeks and trying to figure out all of this whole mess with the 5090's performance, wasn't able to add that much to my test while I still had the 4090, since my time was very limited with it. I'm sorry, it was just a really unfortunate time on my life. Some of those games that people suggested I did get though, and I'm looking at, and they will be in future benchmarking videos, so look forward to that. I know some people are going to skip over this or not pay attention anyway despite all these disclaimers and ask why I didn't test X game because of this, because my last video has taught me that a lot of people just can't listen. Okay, so that incredibly long disclaimer out of the way, let's quickly go over the test configuration methodology I have. Test configuration wise, I have a 7950X 3D Affinity matched to the Vcache cores, 64GB of 6000 MHz CL30 DDR5 RAM, paired with an RTX 4090 and 5090, and running on the Pimax Crystal here with high resolution, which is default 4312 by 5100 per eye, and then on the medium resolution, which is 3232 by 3824 per eye, when more performance was needed. Any exceptions will be noted. I'm also not looking at Pimax's native OpenXR runtime yet here, because it's still got broken frame pacing if you can't get locked to your HMD's refresh rate, which is causing issues on the 5090 right now. Check my video here where I looked at it if you want to know more. It also may or may not matter for performance, but the NVIDIA app was uninstalled during testing because I found it caused certain games I like to test to just not start or crash, namely REA and MSFS 2020. Now then, let's not waste any more time and check the data, shall we? Let's get some of the games I already briefly checked out, starting with Riven. The 5090 is coming out swinging with a strong start. Looking at medium res, the 5090 leads its predecessor by 30 FPS on average, or about a 42% gain. The 1% low don't go up quite as much, but still have a 36% lead. The 0.1% low had an incredible boost with the 5090 though, jumping by a whopping 53% and falling just 2 FPS short of 60. I would say the 4090 still delivers a playable experience at this res, but the 5090 takes it to a nice, if not great, 90 FPS experience, or could do a fairly stable 60 to 120 motion smoothing. Going to high res, both cards suffer an absolutely brutal loss in performance. The 4090 is just not playable anymore, not even able to maintain 42 FPS average. The 5090 is managing 61 on average though, so I would say it's playable, but not that great an experience. Still, the margins between the cards have grown even more, and it's not merely an academic difference given you could still play with the 5090 decently. It's now doing around 47% better on the average FPS and 1% low, while the 0.1% low with the 5090 soars over the prior king by a whole 60% improvement. What's worth noting is that the 5090 at high res is actually not a world apart from the 4090 at medium res. The 4090 at that res is doing better, but the largest margin is the 1% low at about an 18% improvement. Definitely noteworthy, but not a gigantic gap. A quick but interesting note is how resolution affected performance. Both took a beating going to high res, but while medium res with a 4090 does 65 to 73% better depending on what you measure, the 5090's gap is 61 to 65% from high to medium. It's a small relative difference, but does provide the first bit of a trend we'll see where the 5090 is less impacted by scaling up in resolution. Next up is Kayak VR, which has both a lot of data to look at and just some weird things in general. Like I pointed out earlier at the beginning of the video, go back and watch that disclaimer. If you skip to the charts, you know who you are. Starting with medium res, everything is definitely Hertz limited with the exception of the 4090 using MSAA. It is starting to buckle there, but it's far from a bad time. And because of that, there's not a whole lot to talk about here, with the exception of the 0.1% low. All but one result have effectively identical average FPS and 1% low with how Hertz limited I was here, and CapFrameX can't measure past 120 FPS, but the 0.1% low on the 5090 are behind the 4090. Way behind, to where the older card is doing up to over 60% better on this metric. And I can't explain why this is the case, because I saw this both before and after the micro stutter was allegedly fixed. I checked it with FPS VR at even higher resolutions, and FPS VR did not detect any kind of frame drops like this in the GPU frame times. It was perfect by all accounts. But there's still clearly something here FPS VR isn't picking up, and given the investigation by Earthstamper and all the other reports in the Reddit thread of microstutter, it appears to be related to VSync and hitting your target refresh rate. So seems like the 5090 is kinda suffering from success here, and hopefully it'll be fixed in the future. Whatever the case, it's clearly not hitting the 4090s. Moving on to high resolution. Not focusing too much on the 0.1% for now due to the already stated reasons. The 5090 with TAA on it has 1% lows, 27% over the 4090 without any form of AA, and using the same settings, it's 34% better. The 5090 is clearly Hertz limited with TAA, so the gains on average FPS there isn't really worth mentioning. MSAA, though, things get very interesting with this on. The 5090 is still managing to hold over 90 FPS average with fairly well-paced lows, the 0.1% being almost 70, but the 4090 has simply collapsed. The 5090's performance is literally around 2 times better in every single metric with the same settings. In fact, the 5090 is handling MSAA so well that it is outdoing the 4090 at the much lower medium res by a noteworthy degree with it. Average FPS may only be 9% better, but the lows are 24 to 27% better despite the resolution gap. Still, even at high res, as long as you don't use MSAA, the 4090 can deliver a pretty great experience at over 100 FPS average, but the 5090 opens up possibilities the 4090 simply can't do. However, those 0.1% low on the 5090 are weird as hell, so let's take a closer look at the frame time plot for medium res with TAA on both cards, since it was such an unusual result. Remember, for frame times, lower is better because it means that you get the frames to your headset faster. However, you also want a consistent frame time pacing because wild variance can result in stutter and choppiness. Looking at the plot, the 5090 and 4090 largely have a similar overall shape, but with the exception of one notable outlier on the 4090, the 5090 has more numerous smaller frame time spikes, which explains the lower overall performance. And while these spikes shouldn't be ignored, because the sensitive might notice a few rare stutters, it is important to contextualize just how small the 0.1% low is. The 5090's run had 14,520 frames delivered across about 2 minutes. That means the 0.1% of this is 14 frames. That is such a small number that I bet a good chunk of people wouldn't notice it. But that doesn't change the fact it's happening according to the software, and it is enough that some people will probably notice this bit of stutter. And it's not the only game to show this, but some don't have the issue, as we will see next. Up next, in a much simpler analysis, is Metro Awakening. This had the largest margins I saw for any game in the prior video, and it's no different here. At medium res, the 5090 is already kicking the hell out of the prior gen flagship, which is barely managing 90 FPS average, while the newer card is solidly Hertz limited at 120, but it's already 33% improved on average FPS despite that. The lows have some of the highest margins out of any game, even despite not being at full res though, jumping about 30 to 40 FPS over the 4090s. That's a 67% improvement on the 1% low and a 60% increase on the 0.1%. This is already a transformative experience where stutter is vastly less noticeable. After the Kayak VR results, it's absolutely worth pointing out how this game doesn't appear to be suffering the same micro stutter that the 5090 had there, as the 0.1% low is paced quite well with the 1% in average FPS. The fact not every game is exhibiting this makes the results all the more weird and confusing. But at high res, the difference just defies belief. The 5090 is literally doing around 3 times or more better than the 4090 in every metric, which is at an average 36 FPS. Versus the 5090's 100. This is the difference between an utterly unplayable experience and a pretty great 90 Hz or possibly 120 with dips one, if you lowered some settings or res a bit on the newer card. The numbers speak for themselves. The 4090 just cannot handle going up in resolution with this game and had its performance more than cut in half. The 5090 still feels the increase, but at worst, medium res is doing only around 30 to 40% better in the lows. Something about Metro Awakening just seems to respond incredibly well to memory bandwidth, given the increase even at medium res. Comparing high res, calling this revolutionary would be an understatement, and I wish more games saw this insane jump, as I wouldn't need to upgrade for multiple generations if so, but it happening at all is still wonderful to see. And time to look at one of the biggest titles with Skyrim VR, using the February 3rd update for Mad God's Overhaul at stock settings, save for Mantella disabled and depth culling enabled. MGO had an update recently, but was after the 4090 was no longer in my possession, so I could not compare the two cards with it, but at least the 5090 had identical performance at the same settings. At medium res, there are some noteworthy, but not gigantic, margins. Without DLAA, the 5090 leads with a plus 31% average FPS, bringing it close to 90, but still falling just short at 85.7. But given that CAS costs a small amount of performance, disabling it could be enough to tip us over the edge here. The gains in the lows are smaller, with only around a 15 to 20% lead versus the 4090, and these margins are more or less the same when enabling DLAA, which is using the CNN model, give or take a few percent. The absolute gains aren't that great, but it does let the 5090 hit a few key marks the 4090 would fail at if you value that enough, such as making DLA with CAS at medium res possible with a good 60 to 120 reprojection or 72 Hz mode, whereas the 4090 can't do the latter even without DLAA. At high resolution, the gap grows, but not by a tremendous amount. Average FPS is now 42% improved, while the 1% low is a respectable 36%, but the 0.1% low is only up by 25%. These are still definitely enough to make quite the difference, however, because the 4090 just isn't playable anymore at even 45 to 90 motion smoothing. That's simply impossible. The 5090 is so close to 60, but still just shy of it, but that could possibly be fixed by disabling CAS. Nearly 60 FPS average is something I'd still consider playable even without reprojection, as it's important to note this is one of the heavier areas, but I'd still advise the use of upscaling, and I'd say that's much more viable on the 5090 because you've certainly got better odds of getting good frame rates versus the 4090, where I just say give up and lower the res a lot, or you'll have to use some very heavy upscaling. Still pining for that official DLSS and not just DLAA support with community shaders. Do want to take an extensive look at Skyrim with upscaling in the future, since there is definitely enough games which need it to warrant a video on that. and I know people are not going to be happy with the results on MSFS 2020. This was run using DX12 as DirectX 11's performance was broken with the 4090, and the 5090 struggled to launch and be stable at all with DX11. I haven't moved to MSFS 2024 yet because I don't think it's really as stable as it should be. At medium res, the 0.1% low improvement with the 5090 wasn't that big, only 16%, but the 1% in average FPS rose by more respectable 25 and 29%. This is meaningful as it means we're getting high enough average FPS for 60 to 120 reprojection, where the 4090 can only do 45 to 90. That's a very meaningful threshold to hit, but it's still the smallest gain that wasn't Hertz limited. At high resolution, the margins do widen in favor of the 5090, with a 37% improvement on average FPS and 24% on the 0.1% low. But we're reaching the point where it's borderline academic. But for this kind of game, some people may be able to live with it, where the 4090 is just a miserable time. If you want to run at high res though, you're really going to have to use upscaling like DLSS, but the 5090 could perhaps get away with some less aggressive upscaling to get good frames. That's something I may look at in another video. Still, given the kind of game MSFS is and how demanding it can be, getting above 60 FPS average at medium resolution and settings is a pretty important threshold to hit, despite the lower than average gains. But unfortunately, you can't quite unleash the Crystal's full potential even with the 5090 here. After those lackluster numbers, let's look at another playing game with far better ones, Project Wingman. This game has some fascinating results on a couple fronts. In my previous Quest 3 video, I accidentally used FSR upscaling, but that's been corrected here. No upscaling, just running at native resolution, so don't compare it to that one. Starting at medium res, the margins are just kinda average, with the 5090 35% ahead in average FPS, which brings us to a critical threshold for VR though of above 90 FPS average. The lows don't improve as much, but the 1% is rising up by 30% and actually brings it to 72 FPS. That's higher than the 4090's average FPS of 69. The 0.1% low has a disappointingly small margin of only plus 17% though. The moment we flip to high resolution though, things change and get quite fun. It's nowhere near the absurdity of Metro Awakening, but the relative margins have doubled or more. The 5090 is sitting comfy at near 69 FPS average, a gigantic leap of 76% over the 4090's rather pathetic 39 at this res. The lows have shown up a lot as well, to the point where if we compare 0.1% low of 44 with the 5090, it's 13% better than the average FPS of the 4090 at the same res. And given we're running nearly max settings with the 5090, it'd be quite possible to do something like drop a few settings to get closer to 90 with this resolution. While that's kind of just a complete pipe dream on the other card. In fact, the 5090 at high resolution has performance which is almost dead on with its older brother at medium. The 4090 does have a 10% better 0.1% low in this comparison, but considering the 5090 is running a little bit under double the resolution, it's not much to brag about. It's quite impressive how little performance the 5090 loses compared to the 4090 when scaling up res like this, considering we're not Hertz limited. Once again, seeing how the 5090 is generally, but not always, more resistant to the demands of high performance and gets to flex more at higher res versus lower res. And next up is a flat to VR mod, Resident Evil 8 using the upscaler branch. And possibly due to the nature of being a mod with new hardware and drivers, this one had some really weird behavior to it. At high res, I could not launch without DLSS or DLAA enabled, whereas at medium res, I could launch it native, but only on the 4090, it wouldn't work with DLAA enabled. But it would with the 5090, so I just ran it for curiosity's sake. Behavior was really weird with this game on both cards, so I just kind of had to take what data I could get. This said, similar trend being seen. If we compare it medium res without DLAA, the 5090's lead isn't huge, but it's also running close to Hertz limits. The average FPS and 1% low go up by 27 and 25% respectively, which brings it to a comfortable triple-digit FPS experience. Essentially the difference between a 90 and 120 Hz experience. The 0.1% low didn't rise as impressively though, with only a gain of 13%. Interestingly, if we toggle on DLA with a 5090, it's still outperforming the 4090 without it by over 10%, still hitting above 100 FPS average. But comparing the 5090 with or without DLA, the 0.1% low is a mere 2% difference versus the 12 of the other metrics. Possibly the micro stutter. As expected, at high resolution, the 5090 pulls further ahead, seeing up to plus 40% gains on average FPS and still providing a good overall experience with 73 FPS average. The 4090 is, I guess, still playable at 52 FPS, but it's definitely getting uncomfortably low. Once more, the relative gap on the 0.1% low isn't that meaningful. It's only around 11% in favor of the 5090. Overall, not world-changing, but still some noteworthy gains at high res and impressive thresholds hit in this game. And back to much better results, we have Red Matter 2. Here, I only tested the 5090 at high resolution because it was so hertz limited, there simply was no point in testing lower. So we can make this quick. With both at high resolution though, the 5090 brutalizes its processor in the lows, with a staggering leap of plus 65 to 70% on the 1% and 0.1% low respectively. In fact, the frame rate consistency is so good it's the best I have ever measured with CapFrameX. Stuttering simply doesn't exist. The frame rate limit here makes it hard to see how far the 5090 could be ahead in average FPS, but it's worth pointing out the 4090 can't even hit the 120 FPS cap. You could use 90 FPS mode, but while I wouldn't say it'd be a bad experience, going by the large gap between the average FPS and lows, you would be dealing with some dips that would be perceptible, versus the 5090 providing an absolute rock steady experience at high resolution, where you'd be hard pressed to notice any dips. The 4090 needs to drop all the way down to medium res to reach a similar consistency, but the weakness of CapFrameX is that we do seem like we may be so hertz limited it's hard to tell exactly how much headroom is or is not available in this situation. But the improvements at high resolution are quite plain to see. While it's no Metro Awakening, the jump here is just transformative and provides a significantly better experience with the tighter lows and lets you truly take advantage of the crystal's high resolution. And another VR mod, which I strongly suspect is getting hit by micro stutter, Outer Wilds No My VR mod. If we check the medium res runs to see the issue, it's kind of like Kayak VR all over again. The 5090 is solidly hertz limited here, with 1% low there, 41% better than the 4090 at the same res. But the 4090 actually has a slight edge on the 0.1% low, though it is simply by 5%. Both are delivering a pretty good above 100 FPS experience, but even with the possible micro stutter, the 5090 is drastically better 1% low, and actually hitting 120 FPS average will make for a noticeably smoother experience inside the headset. Jumping to high res, there are a few fun things to point out. The lows on the 5090 are ahead by about 27 to 32%, which is, relatively speaking, a smaller gap than held at medium res. However, it makes up for this by having a monstrous 50% improvement in average FPS and is still hitting triple digits. In fact, yet again, we're seeing the 5090 at high resolution perform the same as the 4090 at medium res. And if you have a crystal and have gone between medium and high resolution, there's a pretty significant image quality difference. But quite bizarrely, and what I think is more evidence of driver issue micro stuttering hitting the 5090, is that the 0.1% low basically don't change between medium and high res, despite the 1% low at medium res being 39% better. It's a few percent difference, but that's within run-to-run variance. Overall, the 4090 is still capable of a fine experience even at high resolutions here, but it would take more compromises on settings or lowering resolution to hit 90 FPS and especially 120, whereas the 5090 is ready to go for 90 at high res and wouldn't take that much sacrificing to hit 120. So we're getting both a rather noteworthy uplift and hitting some key thresholds for VR performance. And closing things off, I know we have a big one people have been waiting for or skip straight to, VRChat. Given the nature of the game, it's hard to get a good real-world benchmark in a lobby with lots of people without having two PCs going at once. so I had to settle for a popular but still demanding world with some varied environments. Kicking things off with medium res, the 5090 is just kind of bulletproof to MSAA at ×2 or ×4, so there wasn't much purpose to test without any. However, don't misunderstand, it's not that the 5090 doesn't lose any performance from MSAA, it's the fact that it's hitting Hertz limits through part of the run, and there is also one section of the run where I started to get lightly CPU bound, and VRChat will just kinda be how it is with spikes. So there's not a whole lot to talk about concerning the lows at medium res, but there's still a few things to point out. Namely, how much more severely the 4090 is impacted by higher levels of MSAA, even at this resolution. ×2 doesn't do much, the 1% low and average FPS are only about 15% better without it. But turn on MSAA ×4 and the 4090's performance has gone from triple-digit average FPS with no AA down to 67 with lows in the 40s. The 0.1% low is only about 28% better without AA, but the 1% low and average FPS are far better, at 42 and 52% better respectively. If we compare it to the 5090, the 4090 is just kind of getting murdered. Lows are only 33 to 40% improved, but the average FPS is 59% better with MSAA ×4. Even with some factors limiting gains a bit, this is still wild to see. Once again, if we go to high resolution though, we can see things get very bad for the 4090 very fast, while the 5090 is largely able to keep on going. Comparing the no AA runs and no longer running into Hertz limitations, the 5090 pulls ahead by 35% on average FPS and similarly paced lows, which may not be the highest margin seen in this video, even if still impressive, but lets the 5090 hit that vital above 90 FPS average threshold while the 4090 stuck at 70, which is still a playable experience though. But the same cannot be said once any level of MSAA is applied to the 4090, as it just falls apart. Compared to the 5090 with the same settings at ×2 MSAA, the performance gap has widened significantly, with lows in the very low 30s and average FPS of 51, while the 5090 is still going quite strong at 84 FPS average and lows in the very high 40s to mid 50s. It's actually such a wide gap that the smallest margin, the 0.1% low, is an absurd 56% better than the 4090, while the other two metrics are 64 to 66% improved. MSAA ×4 is just completely unplayable with the 4090 at this res. The 5090 is literally seeing Metro Awakening-like margins of over double performance in everything. In fact, the 5090 is so much more resistant to the effects of MSAA that at high resolution, despite using MSAA ×4, it's outperforming the 4090 with no AA applied. The 5090 being so much more resistant to things like MSAA at high res is great to see, as even at this res, disabling AA wholesale certainly hits image quality a good bit. Even ×2 is a sizable improvement. Well, so that was a lot of data. Now, it is important to keep in mind the 5090 seems to still have some stuttering problems in certain scenarios, mainly if you hit your target's refresh rate, so it may be slightly underperforming some games, but that just said, and overall conclusion-wise, just like my previous analysis showed, the 5090 is a much more exciting card for high-end VR than it is on flat screen. At medium res with the Crystal here, it is not that impressive though, unless you make liberal usage of MSAA, in which case it definitely does perform a hell of a lot better even at that lower resolution. And there you might see upwards of 60% gains. That's world-changing in VR. However, well, a lot of games do use MSAA in VR. There's a lot of big titles which don't, like say MSFS or Skyrim VR. And there, the performance uplifts, considering the cost of the card, it's not that big, and only about 30%, plus 30% or so. There are still cases where I saw noticeably higher gains, even if it's lower res, more like the 45 to 60% range, and don't use MSAA, like Metro Awakening and Riven. Those are kind of exceptions, and more often than not, we saw lower end gains. But if you jump in resolution a lot to what the Crystal normally uses, the 5090 does so much better and gets a jump in most titles, which makes it far more compelling. Around plus 35 to 40% gains becomes what's like a lower end at this res. And there were cases of games which saw disappointingly small gains at medium res, but you go up to high res and suddenly instead of plus 30%, you're now getting plus 50 or even plus 70% better with the 5090 while still at playable FPS. Hell, In several cases, it actually saw such a performance improvement at high resolution that despite rendering almost 2 times the pixels, the 5090 at high res was performing kind of in the ballpark of the 4090 at medium. But before you get too excited, remember it didn't happen every time, and not every game can be something like Metro Awakening where performance literally multiplied. Generally speaking though, from my testing in my past 2 videos here and what I've observed from a few other people doing benchmarks, you should probably only consider this card if you're playing at a render resolution which is significantly higher than, say, 3K by 3K per eye, or if you're using very, very high levels of MSAA. Now, the question of should you buy this though? Well, okay, ignoring how hard it is to get, that's not so easily answered because the 5090's unique nature for VR with its crazy high bandwidth makes it kind of inconsistent. If most of my games saw only a 40% increase, well, I'd be kind of disappointed if not for the fact selling my 4090 paid for most of my card. But a lot of games I play saw a higher uplift or hit key thresholds because of that performance boost, so I'm happy with it. But further complicating things though is that, especially in the US, it seems like 5090's official prices are trending up by a lot. Hell, literally most of the cards I know of have increased by hundreds of dollars just in the gap between this video and my last 5090 one a month ago. And there's just been a lot of issues in VR with this card. Some of them were fixed, yes, but we're also discovering new ones even now. Who knows what we'll find next? This is probably the least stable and worst launch NVIDIA has ever had, and it's barely been 2 months. VR-wise, this card's for a specific niche, and if you're on a 4090, I'd probably skip this unless you're already on or going for one of those many high-end upcoming headsets like the Megane X 8K, the Play for Dream, the Pimax Crystal Super, something like that. Or if you just truly have that much money to burn and demand the best, because nothing else really touches this card, and versus literally everything but the 4090, it's probably going to be a pretty gigantic uplift at any res. Be financially responsible if you get this though, please, and maybe consider having some good fire insurance. And there is the video. Not too surprising results if you saw my last one, but it was still worth checking out the Crystal here because it had some pretty nice gains. Surprised at what you saw? Considering a 5090 yourself now? Let me know down below. Probably gonna have some more videos testing this on the Crystal Super and with upscaling, hopefully in the not too distant future. Really interested in how the 5090 is going to manage there. If you made it to the end of the video, consider subscribing to stick around and see what I do next. If not, well, thanks for watching anyway, and maybe I'll see you again sometime in the recommendeds. Later!